When we look back at the history of Native America, the images that often come to mind are battles, broken treaties, and the fight for survival against overwhelming odds. Yet behind each of those moments stood remarkable leaders, men and women, whose courage, vision, and determination shaped not only the fate of their own nations, but also the story of this continent itself. In this documentary, we will journey across the land from the sweeping plains to the deserts of the Southwest, from the forests of the Northeast to the coastal waters of the Northwest. Along the way, we will meet the great Native American leaders who rose in times of struggle, guided their people through unimaginable trials, and left legacies that still echo through history. The story of Sitting Bull begins with the wide plains of the Dakotas, where the Lakota Sioux lived in close connection to the buffalo and the land. Sitting Bull was not only a chief but also a spiritual guide, a man his people trusted for vision as much as for leadership. From his youth, he was known for bravery in battle, yet his greatest strength was the wisdom that came from his role as a holy man. In the 1870s, as the United States pushed further into Sioux territory, Sitting Bull refused to sign treaties that demanded land in exchange for broken promises. He believed that no paper could replace the bond between his people and their homeland. His faith in unity brought together Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho warriors at a moment of crisis. That vision reached its height in 1876 at the Battle of the Little Bighorn, where Native forces defeated General Custer and the 7th Cavalry. Sitting Bull's victory was brief in military terms, but it became a lasting symbol of resistance. He reminded his people that even in the face of overwhelming power, faith, courage, and unity could still shape history. While Sitting Bull gave vision, Crazy Horse gave action. He was a quiet man, often described as reserved and humble, yet on the battlefield he was fearless. Crazy Horse led his warriors directly into danger, charging at the heart of enemy lines, with a calm determination that inspired all who followed him. At Little Bighorn, his assault helped break Custer's formation, turning the tide of the battle. For the Lakota, he was the embodiment of defiance, a leader who lived for freedom and refused compromise. He rejected photographs, fame, and political attention, choosing instead to dedicate himself fully to the fight. In 1877, after years of resistance, Crazy Horse surrendered under a flag of truce. Shortly afterward, he was killed while in custody, his death clouded by controversy and grief. Though his life ended young, his name became legend, standing forever as a reminder that some leaders fight not for treaties, but for the very idea of liberty itself. Red Cloud offered another kind of leadership. He was both warrior and diplomat, a strategist who understood that survival sometimes depended on negotiation as much as force. In the 1860s, when U.S. soldiers built forts along the Bozeman Trail through Sioux hunting grounds, Red Cloud organized a campaign of resistance. His warriors struck with precision, ambushing troops and supply lines. The conflict became known as Red Cloud's War, and it ended with one of the rarest outcomes in Native history, a clear victory. The U.S. Army abandoned its forts and signed the Treaty of Fort Laramie in 1868, which recognized Sioux control of the Black Hills. For a moment, Red Cloud achieved what others could not. Yet the discovery of gold in the Black Hills shattered the agreement, and the United States broke its promises. Red Cloud spent his later years urging his people to survive under the reservation system, still advocating for them even as the world changed around him. His leadership proved that strength could come from both the bow and the council fire. On the southern plains, Quanah Parker rose to prominence among the Comanche. His heritage was unique, the son of Comanche chief Peta Nocona, and Cynthia Ann Parker, a white woman captured as a child and adopted into the tribe. Quanah carried both worlds in his blood, and his life became a bridge between them. As a young warrior, Quanah led raids across Texas, fighting rangers and soldiers with the unmatched horsemanship of the Comanche. For years, his people resisted American expansion, But by the 1870s, the buffalo herds had vanished, and the Red River War pushed the Comanche to the edge of survival. Quanah was the last great chief to surrender. Yet instead of fading into obscurity, he transformed. On the reservation, he built alliances with U.S. officials, secured resources for his people, and encouraged new forms of survival, such as ranching. He traveled to Washington, argued for native rights, and became one of the most influential leaders of his time. Quanah Parker showed that leadership could mean more than resistance. It could also mean guiding one's people through change without losing their identity. He stood as both warrior and statesman, a man of the old world and the new. Together, Sitting Bull, Crazy Horse, Red Cloud, and Quanah Parker reveal the many faces of leadership on the Great Plains. One gave vision, another gave action, one secured treaties, and another bridged two worlds. Each carried the weight of his people's survival, and each left behind a legacy that history cannot forget. In the deserts and mountains of the Southwest, one name became legendary: Geronimo of the Chiricahua Apache. Born in the early 1820s, he grew up in a world of constant struggle. Both Mexico and the United States pushed into Apache lands, and violence was a constant reality. Geronimo's story took a decisive turn when Mexican soldiers attacked his camp and killed his wife, his mother, and his children. From that day on, he dedicated his life to resistance. For decades, Geronimo led small bands of warriors in daring raids and relentless campaigns. He became known for his cunning ability to evade capture, using the harsh terrain of the Southwest to his advantage. U.S. and Mexican soldiers pursued him across deserts, mountains, and into Mexico itself, yet Geronimo always seemed to escape. To his people, he was a defender who refused to surrender. To his enemies, he was almost a ghost, appearing and disappearing without warning. In 1886, after years of pursuit, Geronimo finally surrendered to U.S. forces. He spent the rest of his life as a prisoner of war, traveling far from his homeland. Yet even in captivity, his name carried power. Newspapers across the United States printed his image, turning him into a symbol of both fear and admiration. To this day, Geronimo represents the unbroken spirit of resistance, a man who never gave up his identity and whose name still stands for defiance in the face of overwhelming odds. Long before Geronimo's final campaigns, another Apache leader had already carved his name into history. Cochise, chief of the Chiricahua Apache, was known not only for his strength in battle, but also for his honor. For many years, Cochise sought to live in peace with Americans moving through Apache territory. But a single event changed everything. In 1861, U.S. soldiers falsely accused Cochise of kidnapping a boy during a raid. Though he had nothing to do with it, the soldiers tried to capture him. Cochise escaped, but some of his family members were taken and executed. The betrayal ignited a bitter war that lasted over a decade. Cochise struck back with determination, using ambushes and knowledge of the rugged landscape to fight the U.S. Army. Despite years of conflict, Cochise was not driven only by hatred. He wanted safety for his people and dignity in their dealings with outsiders. In the early 1870s, weary of war, he accepted peace talks with U.S. General Oliver O. Howard. The result was an agreement that allowed the Apache to remain on part of their homeland, free from immediate removal. For the rest of his life, Cochise honored that peace. He died in 1874, remembered by his people as a leader who defended their land with courage, but also sought to end bloodshed when honor had been restored. Cochise's legacy is that of a man who balanced war with peace, who proved that even in times of deep injustice, a leader could seek dignity and fairness for his people. Further to the north, among the Navajo, another leader rose in a time of great suffering. Manuelito was a chief who lived through one of the darkest chapters in Navajo history, the Long Walk. In the 1860s, U.S. troops carried out a scorched earth campaign, destroying crops, homes, and livestock to force the Navajo from their land. Manuelito fought fiercely against the soldiers, resisting every attempt to drive his people away. Eventually overwhelmed by military power and starvation, the Navajo were forced to march hundreds of miles to an internment camp in eastern New Mexico. This brutal journey, known as the Long Walk, killed countless men, women, and children. Manuelito endured the suffering alongside his people, but he never gave up hope of returning home. In 1868, after years of hardship, the Navajo were allowed to return to part of their homeland. Manuelito then shifted his focus. He understood that the future would require adaptation as well as resistance. He urged the Navajo to educate their children, believing that knowledge would be a tool to preserve their culture and identity in a changing world. Manuelito's story shows that leadership is not only about fighting battles. It is also about guiding a people through survival and renewal. His life bridged the despair of exile and the promise of rebuilding, leaving the Navajo with a path forward that honored their traditions. Geronimo Cochise and Manuelito each carried the burdens of their time in different ways. One became a symbol of unyielding defiance, another sought peace after years of betrayal, and a third helped his people endure and rebuild after forced exile. Together they reveal the many faces of leadership in the harsh landscapes of the Southwest, where survival required both courage and wisdom. Among the forests and mountains of the Pacific Northwest, one leader stands out as a symbol of dignity and sorrow. Chief Joseph of the Nez Perce was born into a world of rivers, valleys, and ancestral homelands that his people had lived on for centuries. But by the 1870s, pressure from settlers and the U.S. government threatened to push the Nez Perce from their land in the Wallowa Valley. When the army demanded their removal, Chief Joseph chose not to surrender easily. In 1877, he led his people on one of the most remarkable retreats in Native American history. For more than 300 miles, the Nez Perce fought running battles while trying to reach safety in Canada. Families, elders, and children moved alongside warriors, all driven by the hope of freedom. The pursuit lasted months, crossing mountains, rivers, and harsh terrain. At last, only 40 miles from the Canadian border, exhausted and surrounded, Chief Joseph realized that further resistance meant only more death. His surrender speech became legendary. "From where the sun now stands, I will fight no more forever." These words captured not only the grief of a leader, but the sorrow of an entire people. Though forced onto reservations, Chief Joseph continued to advocate for his people with dignity and restraint, reminding the world that the Nez Perce were not broken, only displaced. Along the misty shores of Puget Sound, Chief Seattle rose to prominence in the mid-1800s. He was a leader of both the Suquamish and Duwamish tribes, respected for his wisdom, diplomacy, and ability to navigate a time of profound change. Unlike many leaders who turned immediately to war, Chief Seattle recognized the overwhelming power of the newcomers. Instead, he sought to preserve peace while protecting his people's identity as much as possible. In 1854, he delivered a speech that has since become famous, one that reflected a deep philosophy about the relationship between people and the natural world. "The earth does not belong to us. We belong to the earth," the speech declared. Though the exact words have been shaped and retold over time, the spirit of the message is clear. Chief Seattle emphasized harmony with the land, respect for ancestors, and the understanding that the earth is not simply a resource, but a sacred trust. His diplomacy helped ease tensions during the early years of settlement in Washington Territory, though his people still faced removal and cultural loss. Yet his name lives on, carried by the city of Seattle, a permanent reminder that his vision of respect for the land is just as relevant today as it was more than a century ago. Further south in Northern California, the Modoc people faced their own desperate struggle. Their leader was Kintpuash, remembered by settlers as Captain Jack. In the 1870s, the Modoc were forced from their homeland near the California-Oregon border and ordered onto a reservation shared with their traditional rivals. Conflict soon broke out, and the Modoc under Captain Jack chose to resist. What followed was the Modoc War of 1872 to 1873. With only about 50 warriors, Captain Jack led his people into the lava beds, a rugged volcanic landscape full of caves and sharp rocks. There they held off hundreds of U.S. soldiers for months. Using the terrain to their advantage, the Modoc fought with determination, inflicting heavy casualties on an army that outnumbered them many times over. Despite his courage, Captain Jack was placed in an impossible position. Under pressure from his followers, he agreed to assassinate a U.S. general during peace negotiations. This act sealed his fate. Eventually, the Modoc were overwhelmed and Captain Jack was captured and executed. His story is tragic, but it demonstrates the courage of a small nation that stood against immense odds. Captain Jack's stand in the lava beds is still remembered as a moment when bravery, desperation, and the struggle for survival collided. Chief Joseph, Chief Seattle, and Captain Jack each faced the unstoppable tide of change in different ways. One led his people on a long march of resistance, another sought peace through wisdom and diplomacy, and a third fought with desperate courage from a volcanic stronghold. Their stories remind us that leadership is never one path, but many shaped by circumstance, vision, and the will to protect one's people. In the dense forests and river valleys of the Northeast, one of the earliest and most influential native leaders emerged. His name was Hiawatha, a man whose story lies at the very foundation of native political history. Though parts of his life are wrapped in legend, what is remembered is his role in creating the Iroquois Confederacy. Centuries before Europeans arrived, warfare and blood feuds plagued the Iroquois nations. Hiawatha, working alongside a spiritual figure known as the Peacemaker, sought to end this endless cycle of violence. Together, they brought the warring nations of the Mohawk, Oneida, Onondaga, Cayuga, and Seneca into a single union. This alliance, later joined by the Tuscarora, became known as the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, or the Iroquois League. What Hiawatha and the Peacemaker established was more than just a truce. They created a lasting system of governance, with councils, laws, and balance between the nations. This political structure influenced not only native life for centuries, but even inspired some of the ideas behind the U.S. Constitution. Hiawatha's vision showed that leadership could take the form of unity, building peace not with the bow or the blade, but with words, agreements, and shared governance. Many generations later, during the upheaval of the American Revolution, another Mohawk leader rose to prominence. His name was Thayendanegea, known to the English as Joseph Brant. Unlike Hiawatha, whose legacy was unity, Brant's life was marked by the struggle to balance two worlds. Educated by missionaries and fluent in English, Joseph Brant moved easily between native and European societies. Yet he never abandoned his Mohawk identity. During the Revolution, he sided with the British, believing that an alliance with the Crown offered the best hope for protecting native lands from the expansionist pressures of the American colonists. He led Mohawk warriors in campaigns across New York and Pennsylvania, fighting with both courage and tactical skill. But Brant was more than a warrior. He was also a diplomat. He traveled to London, where he met with the King of England and argued for native rights. He negotiated tirelessly for his people, seeking land recognition and protection in a world rapidly changing around them. Though the British ultimately lost the war, Brant's efforts secured new lands for the Mohawk in Canada. His life illustrates the challenge of leadership in a divided time, how to fight for survival, navigate diplomacy, and preserve a nation's future in the midst of revolution. In the early 19th century, another visionary leader rose, one whose dreams stretched far beyond his own people. Tecumseh of the Shawnee imagined something unprecedented, a united native confederacy across the entire continent, one strong enough to stop American expansion. From his youth, Tecumseh witnessed the destruction brought by settlers pushing into Shawnee lands. He became a gifted orator and a skilled warrior, but his true power lay in his vision. Traveling from the Great Lakes to the Gulf Coast, he urged tribes to join together, to put aside old rivalries and form one great alliance. Tecumseh's movement gained momentum as American settlement advanced. He allied with the British during the War of 1812, hoping that partnership would strengthen his cause. His speeches, remembered even by his enemies, were filled with passion and clarity. He declared that no single tribe had the right to sell land because it belonged to all native peoples collectively. Yet his dream was cut short. In 1813, Tecumseh was killed at the Battle of the Thames in Canada. With his death, the vision of a pan-tribal confederacy collapsed, but his legacy endured. To native peoples, Tecumseh became a symbol of unity, courage, and foresight. To historians, he stands as a reminder that leadership can mean seeing beyond one's own nation, imagining a greater whole. Hiawatha, Joseph Brant, and Tecumseh reveal the many dimensions of leadership in the Northeast. One created peace through unities, another balanced war and diplomacy across cultures, and a third dreamed of a continent-wide alliance. Together they show that leadership is not bound by a single generation or a single style. It can take the form of peacemaking negotiation or bold visions that reach far into the future. In the swamps and forests of Florida, one leader became the face of unyielding resistance. His name was Osceola of the Seminole. During the 1830s, the United States sought to remove the Seminole from their lands and push them west under the Indian Removal Act, but Osceola refused. Though not born a chief, his charisma, bravery, and determination quickly made him the natural leader of his people. He led the Seminole into what became the Second Seminole War, one of the costliest conflicts the U.S. ever fought against Native Americans. Osceola's tactics were unconventional but effective. Using the dense swamps as natural defenses, the Seminole struck with surprise and vanished just as quickly, frustrating a much larger enemy force. In 1837, Osceola was captured under a flag of truce, a betrayal that shocked even some Americans at the time. He later died in captivity far from his homeland. Yet his spirit endured. For the Seminole and for many others, Osceola became a symbol of courage, proof that even the smallest nation could resist removal with honor and determination. Far to the north, another leader made his mark in the years after the French and Indian War. Pontiac, chief of the Ottawa, understood that the British victory over France in 1763 would bring sweeping changes to native lands. Determined to resist, he organized one of the largest native uprisings of the 18th century. Pontiac's Rebellion, as it came to be known, brought together numerous tribes across the Great Lakes region. They attacked British forts and settlements, seeking to drive out the new occupiers and preserve native independence. At its height, the rebellion threatened British control across a wide swath of North America. Though the uprising was eventually contained, its impact was profound. The British government, realizing the cost of constant warfare, issued the Proclamation of 1763, which attempted to halt colonial settlement west of the Appalachian Mountains. For a time, native lands received official recognition. Pontiac's efforts demonstrated the power of unity and forced a global empire to take native concerns seriously. In the Midwest, the Sauk leader Black Hawk stood against the loss of ancestral homelands. By the early 1830s, pressure from American settlers pushed the Sauk and their allies west of the Mississippi River. But Black Hawk refused to accept the cession of his people's lands, which he believed had been signed under false pretenses. In 1832, he led his band, including families back across the Mississippi, in an attempt to reclaim their homes in Illinois. This act sparked the Black Hawk War. Though his following numbered only a few hundred, Black Hawk resisted with courage against thousands of soldiers and militia. The conflict was short but brutal. Pursued relentlessly, his people suffered great losses, especially among the women and children who had accompanied him. Black Hawk was eventually captured and imprisoned, But even in defeat, he carried himself with dignity. His dictated autobiography, published soon after, gave voice to his perspective and remains one of the earliest Native autobiographies in American history. Black Hawk's struggle, though tragic, became a reminder of the desperate choices forced upon Native leaders in an era of relentless expansion. Osceola Pontiac and Black Hawk. Each fought in different regions and in different times. Yet their stories share the same thread, the determination to defend homeland and identity against impossible odds. Whether in the swamps of Florida, the forests of the Great Lakes, or the prairies of the Midwest, their leadership showed that Native resistance was not confined to one place, but stretched across the entire continent. As we have seen, the great Native American leaders were more than warriors. They were visionaries, diplomats, reformers, and guardians of culture. Each in his own way carried the weight of survival, balancing resistance with adaptation, courage with wisdom, and tradition with change. From the sweeping plains to the deserts of the Southwest, from the forests of the Northeast to the rugged coasts of the Northwest, these leaders stood at the crossroads of history. Their choices shaped not only the fate of their nations, but the very story of this continent. Their stories remind us that leadership is not only about winning battles, but about preserving identity, dignity, and the future of one's people. If you want to explore more hidden chapters of Native American history, subscribe to our channel. Every week we bring you stories of courage, tragedy, and survival that shaped this land.